Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. Today I'm going to talk about another disturbing book that was recommended to me, The Troop by Nick Cutter. If you've seen my Tenders the Flesh video, and it looks like a lot of you have, then you should know what to expect by now. I'm going to go through the entire book in all of its gory details and summarize the story in a way that lets you experience all the disturbing content without having to read the whole book. If you're interested in that kind of thing, then this video is for you. If you're not interested in disturbing media, then I suggest you watch one of my album explained videos instead. This video is going to be slightly different from my Tenders the Flesh video because I'm writing the script as I read the book rather than summarizing it after the fact. There are some details that I got out of order or kind of missed or mixed up on in that last video, so this should help with that. This way we can experience the story together. And obviously, I've already written the script, that's why I'm making the video now, but my script are my thoughts as I was reading it. This book does contain some pretty heavy themes talking about violence and torture and eating things you shouldn't be eating and even some animal cruelty. So if those are big no-nos for you, if you don't want to hear about that, then again, please watch a different video. I don't blame you for not wanting to engage with that stuff. It's just, I don't know, sick people like myself and some of you guys that want to engage with that kind of content. There's nothing wrong with that either. But anyway, let's get into it. The book opens up with an article from a tabloid or a conspiracy magazine. In the town of Prince Edward Island, a woman has her truck stolen by somebody that she refers to as Starvin' Marvin. It seems that he's somewhat of an urban legend. She says that this man stopped by her diner and ate 5 breakfast platters before trying to eat the napkins out of the napkin dispenser, and then he left without saying a word. That is when he stole her truck. Despite eating so much, he is described as incredibly pale and thin, like malnourished and emaciated. The woman relaying the story also says that she could hear something under his skin, and the tabloid then asks the readers for more information regarding this mysterious man. Our perspective then shifts to that of Starvin' Marvin himself. We next see Starvin' Marvin on a boat traveling along the water around the island. He is completely obsessed with the idea of eating and is still starving despite having eaten so much at the diner that his stomach lining has actually ruptured and split open, but he's just not aware of that fact. He can't feel it. In this kind of hallucinatory state, thinking about food, he thinks about all of his favorite food before picturing some roadkill that he saw when he was driving the stolen truck. He had to stop himself from eating it off the road, but now he's thinking that he wishes he had eaten it and that he's worried that something is coming for him. Despite these alarming and ravenous thoughts, he says that he doesn't want to hurt anybody, and he also says that whatever happened to him will make Typhoid Mary look like Mary Poppins. My theory is that he's the product of some sort of genetic experimentation. While on the boat, he says that he is not an evil man, but that he did what anyone in his position would have done. He then sees an island come into view and notices a campfire. We then get a brief insert of a geological survey for Falstaff Island, which is located off the coast of Prince Edward Island. We can assume that this is where Starvin' Marvin has just ended up. The survey says that the island is completely uninhabited and is 10 kilometers in circumference. The only shelter there is a winterized government emergency shelter, which has a cabin and an underground cellar. Throughout the entire book, we're going to get a lot of these different inserts kind of in between chapters, so I'll mention those when they come up. They're all interesting. They all have to do with essentially like official documents that come after the story has taken place. This is the one instance where it's kind of before the story's taken place. There's a couple other that are like that. But again, just these inserts that kind of give us more of a view of what the world is like here. The story then picks up again with a new character, Scoutmaster Tim Riggs. Tim is a doctor that has moved to Prince Edward Island over a decade ago. He has been a scoutmaster since he has joined the island, and his troop of venturers is off to this island for a couple days of camping. They're currently staying in the emergency shelter. They're staying in the cabin. Tim reflects on the boys as he drinks a little bit of scotch. This is something that he says he shouldn't be seen doing as the town doctor. He thinks it's not proper. He has a radio with him in case of emergency, and the entire group was dropped off by a boat, so now they have no way returning to the mainland except for the boat that's going to come pick them up in a couple days. That can't be a good sign. The 5 boys in the scout troop are Kent, Ephraim, Max, Shelley, and Newton, who they call Newt. We don't know much about them other than the fact that they have been scouts since they were little, and they all enjoy it. They aren't forced to be in the program, and that this trip is their last major excursion together before they age out of the scouting program. I was actually in Boy Scouts growing up, and I am an Eagle Scout. I just couldn't tell you most of what I learned because it was a long time ago. I actually did have like 4 of my best friends who were in scouts with me, and we went camping all the time. So this is like, it feels kind of like a personal story to me. Like I could imagine myself being in these characters' position, which I'm sure will be very fun as awful things happen to these kids later. The only kid of note so far in the group is Newt. Tim describes Newt as a huge nerd, so roasted, I guess. As Tim stands on the dock sipping his scotch, he is attacked by mosquitoes. They're just like constantly bearing down on him and eating him. And he can hear the sound of a boat making landfall at the island. No doubt, Starvin' Marvin has arrived. During this chapter, Tim also reflects on this passage from a Carl Jung book that says, "It is a fact that wickedness cannot be denied. The wickedness of others becomes our own wickedness because it kindles something evil in our own hearts." We then shift to Starvin' Marvin's perspective again as he lands on the island and crawls along the beach. He drinks the dirty sea, ocean water, and eats both a crab and a spider alive before seeing the faint light of the emergency shelter in the distance. We then get a chapter of Ephraim, one of the scouts, telling a scary story to the rest of the troop. He talks about a group of Nepalese military assassins and says that their plane went down in the area around Prince Edward Island. He says they stalk around at night and kill campers if their shoelaces aren't tied in a specific way that these assassins tie them. Newt starts to doze off and he actually falls out of his bunk and lands on the ground. Tim tells the boys that it's time to head to bed and they all retire for the night. Before they fall asleep, Ephraim tells Newt that the Gurkhas, which is the name of those military assassins I mentioned, are going to get him. He's just telling ghost stories. While getting ready for bed, Tim hears something in the woods. He takes his hunting knife with him, which is his only weapon, and he heads out. He finds Starvin' Marvin, who repulses him as he approaches and asks for food. Tim agrees. He doesn't want the man to know that the boys are with him, though, so he says that he's out doing a geological survey by himself. He is deeply uncomfortable with having Marvin around him, which makes sense. Tim leads Marvin to the emergency shelter, like the cellar underneath it, so the boys can't see him, but he does let the boys know what happened. They ask if they can help, and he tells them just to stay in their rooms, and he actually locks the door so they can't leave. He then tries to call for help on the radio, but as he does this, Marvin freaks out and tackles him, destroying the radio. They fight for a minute, and Marvin actually coughs on Tim, and he almost vomits this weird bile onto him, but Tim is able to knock him out. The boys try to break the door down and help him while this is happening, but he insists that they stay in the room. He notices that Marvin's clothes are much too big for him and that his stomach has a lot of loose skin. But now, since the radio is gone, the group is completely cut off from the outside world. A news article then tells us that the military has arrived and established a no-fly and no-watercraft zone around the island. Any requests for more information are rebuffed, but the military doesn't appear to approach Falstaff Island, however. The next morning, the scouts wake up and want to know what is going on. Tim has tied Marvin to a chair, and he can feel a burning sensation on his face where Marvin coughed on him during their scuffle. He hands the boys a walkie-talkie and tells them to go on their planned orienteering course by themselves. He was going to accompany them, but he tells them just do it by yourselves. Kent, who is the largest and meanest boy, is upset with this, but Tim tells him that scouts are supposed to obey their scoutmasters without question. The boys head off and Tim starts to worry. He checked the boat that Marvin came in on, but the spark plugs are missing and the boat won't start. They're stuck on the island until their scheduled rescue comes for them. We then get another excerpt from a magazine article written years after the main story. We find out that Starvin' Marvin was actually a man named Thomas Paget. He was a large person from birth and is now being called the Patient Zero for a plague that has ravaged the world. We were also told about Dr. Clive Edgerton, who seems to be the one that did this to Thomas. He's referred to as Joseph Mengele 2.0, who was a Nazi scientist during World War II who did some awful experiments to a lot of people in concentration camps. And it seems that whatever Thomas has, it was very contagious and very deadly, and essentially his disease was seen as the beginning of this terrible plague. We then come back to the boys who are arguing about who should get to use the walkie-talkie. Tim had given it to Max, but Kent, who again is the biggest of the 5, ends up forcing Max to give it to him. We learn that Max and Ephraim have been best friends since they were really little. We also learn that Kent's dad is a police officer who takes Kent along with him and tells him about all the dirty secrets about what is going on in the town. Kent seems to revel in his own physical stature and his authority over others, but all of the boys seem to enjoy picking on Newt. He's kind of like the butt of all their jokes. The boys continue their journey following the compass bearing that Tim gave them, and they're following Kent, and it leads them to a sheer cliff that they perilously travel across. All of the boys are scared, but nobody really wants to say anything. None of them want to be like not brave. They roast Kent for leading them there, and he seems unbothered, but he's actually ashamed of his lack of leadership. There's kind of this war going on in his own head. He thinks about his dad calling him a sheep, and then bites down on his own tongue so hard that it starts to bleed. It seems that Kent is more bothered by what people think of him than he is letting on. The boys end up all making it across the cliff, and they notice the military helicopters and boats in the distance. We then get another insert that is a piece of evidence recovered after the fact in the form of Ephraim's journal. He is writing to his psychiatrist about some anger issues that he has. He says that whenever he gets angry, he has the urge to do something dangerous, and that is what calms him down. He recounts a time when he was younger and a carnival came to Prince Edward Island and a tiger got loose. The entire town went looking for it, but Ephraim ended up finding the tiger in his backyard. The tiger was malnourished and beaten down, so he ended up taking care of it and feeding it for a couple days until it looked a lot better. Ephraim says that the tiger didn't belong in the circus and that he feels like he doesn't belong in the world that he lives in. He ended up growing an attachment to this tiger even though the tiger was dangerous. That was up until Kent's dad found the tiger and shot it and killed it. The boys go exploring more and find a tide pool. Shelly, who is kind of the quiet one of the group, ends up finding a crayfish and he picks it up and sadistically pops one of its eyes and also pulls off one of its claws. We haven't gotten much information about him, but it seems like he has some alarming tendencies, to say the least. The boys light a fire and Ephraim says that Thomas, the skinny man, Starvin' Marvin, looks just like his grandma did before she died of cancer. They wonder what he could be sick with, but assume he'll be fine because he's with Tim, who is a doctor after all. We then get another piece of evidence in the form of a letter that Newt wrote to his psychiatrist, who's actually the same one that Ephraim is seeing. He writes about his cool cousin that died in a farming accident. After he died, Newt created a Facebook profile with his pictures, and he ended up becoming friends with a lot of people online. Newt feels that people dislike him for the way that he looks, and that he thinks that if he looked more like his cousin, then everything would be fine. He says that the person that he made up in his head would never be friends with him. Just another kind of sad dimension to these characters, Newt's kind of poor self-image that he has of himself. The boys return to the cabin where Tim has quarantined Thomas off in the cellar. When Thomas woke up, he tried to eat the couch he was on and then he just passed out again. Tim decides that he needs to do surgery, but he isn't an expert in that field, and he asks Max to help him with the surgery since Max has done some taxidermy work with his father, who is a mortician. Tim and Max get ready for the surgery, and Tim notes that he himself has lost 20 pounds since last night, so it seems like whatever Thomas has, it is passed on to Tim. They cut Thomas open and see that his body has started eating away at his own muscles for sustenance. That's why he's so malnourished. They cut into the stomach and they seem to find another white stomach inside of his stomach. Tim attempts to make another incision in this second stomach, and what could only be described as a giant white tapeworm explodes from Thomas's body. Max and Tim watch in horror as it bursts from the incision and seems to want to attack the two of them. It stands up and is snapping towards them. Thomas then wakes up as he is being operated on and sees this massive worm protruding from his stomach. Thomas understandably freaks out, and then the tapeworm turns around and wraps itself around his neck and strangles him to death. It then retreats back into the incision, back into his stomach. Tim goes after it and he starts slicing it up. And then inside the worm, when it's been sliced up, you can see that it has a brown gooey substance. But the worm doesn't seem to have any organs inside of it, if that makes sense. It's just this weird slug looking thing. It doesn't have any anatomy. After Tim seems to have killed the worm, he tells Max to get out and he starts drinking from the bottle of scotch again. He says that worms can't get you if you're drinking scotch. At this point, we can assume that Tim is kind of going off the deep end. He has just seen something that's completely unexplainable and is worried that that same fate is what's waiting for him since he figures that he's caught this disease that Thomas had. Later that night, the entire troop is sitting around the campfire with Tim. He explains that the man had a giant tapeworm. It was a worm that kept eating, and that's why Thomas couldn't feel full even after eating so much. Now that Thomas was dead, the parasitic worm had died too, since it's a parasite and parasites need their host to live in order to stay alive. Shelly then does the sensible thing and asks to leave, and Tim says that he will take them home in the morning. We can also see that Tim has a sort of growing contempt for these boys now. He has this inner voice that is snapping at them, and he's just trying to keep it together. Kent asks to see the worm, and Tim, of course, tells him no, But Kent is massive and tired of taking orders, so he heads to the cabin, and Tim can't find it in himself to put up any more of a fight. We then get another piece of evidence in the form of a lab journal of Dr. Clive Edgerton. He is testing his tapeworm on a guinea pig. The animal is injected with the worm, and over the course of a couple hours, it grows increasingly hungry until it starts eating itself. It chews off its own paws and eats its own hair. The animal dies, and then the worm dies shortly afterwards. Again, it's a parasite. The guinea pig ended up losing nearly 2/3 of its total weight during this process. Back on the island, Kent and the rest of the boys walk towards the cellar, and they find Thomas's corpse inside. Tim ends up chasing after them and tries to assert his authority, but he is too tired and too drunk to do anything meaningful. He angrily lashes out at the boys and insists that the boat is coming to pick them up tomorrow when they express concern that nobody's coming to rescue them. Kent and Shelley get fed up with Tim, and all of the boys end up tackling him, and they lock him in the cellar. They say that he is infected and that he needs to be separated until the rescue crew comes the next day. Tim is too beaten down and drunk to do anything about it, and in victory, Kent takes a drink from the scotch bottle that Tim has been drinking from all night. We then get an excerpt from the testimony of Dr. Edgerson's research assistant. He says that they were studying the effects of a tapeworm's ability to cause weight loss and reverse aging in humans. While he was one of the scientists working on the project, he insists that Edgerton was the genius behind the whole thing. Back on the island, Max and Newt look up at the stars. Newt worries that they did the wrong thing by locking Tim up, but Max just tells him to shut up. He says that only Kent knows the combination to the lock they put on the door, so they can't really do anything about it. But despite his outward appearance, Max seems bothered with their actions and worries that something bad is coming for them. He can just feel it in the air. We then get a notice from CNN that tells us that Falstaff Island has now been completely quarantined by the military due to a biological incident of unknown origin. The military says that the island is currently unoccupied. With Tim locked in the cellar, he starts to think about what to do next. He notices a small strip or sliver of light coming through the room and a small gap in the door, and he takes a lot of weird comfort in the fact that he has this tiny amount of light. A voice in his head starts to tell him to eat anything he can find, and he obeys this voice and starts to eat the wallpaper off of the wall. Now, sitting with paper-cut lips and a tongue sticky from the ancient wallpaper glue, he looks around for something else to eat. As he does this, Shelley cheerfully sings outside while he covers the hole in the door, leaving Tim in total darkness. Tim begs him to stop so he won't be alone in the darkness, but Shelley doesn't listen. The voice in Tim's head just tells him to eat more and more. So Shelley is quickly becoming a problem. We learn that he blocked the light intentionally. He knows that the boat is not coming to rescue them, but this doesn't seem to really bother him. He goes outside and tries to burn a spider alive, and it seems that he gets a kick out of torturing small animals, which is the classic sign of a psychopath or sociopath. He recalls how his dog once got sick and pooped out or passed a massive 7-foot tapeworm, and Shelley just kept it and examined it. Again, Shelley is now ecstatic at the idea that the boat isn't coming to rescue them. This is interesting because he was the one that demanded to be brought home just a couple hours earlier, but it seems like the capture of Tim has changed his mind on that matter. The boys all fall asleep that night, and in the morning they find that their cooler of food is missing. Ephraim is very upset about this, and he asks Shelley and Kent where it went since they were staying up later. They insist that an animal dragged it off during the night. Ephraim tries to contain his temper and goes off to smoke a cigarette. And it's clear that all the boys except for Shelley are rattled from the events of the night before. We then get another testimony about Dr. Edgerton. We learn that he selected Thomas as his test subject by trolling around bars at night waiting for somebody desperate enough. The scientists knew going in that there was no cure for what they were about to do to this test subject. The boys are now waiting on the shore for the boat to pick them up, but it doesn't come. They don't know that the military has quarantined the island. They also find the cooler of food that has been completely ransacked like an animal has gotten to it. They're upset for a moment, but they know that they will be picked up soon. We shift to Kent's perspective and learn that he was the one who ate all of the food. The sickness is now setting in. It appears he got infected by drinking from the scotch bottle that Tim was drinking from, and now he has this unstoppable urge to eat everything that he can. He snuck away at night and ate the food in the cooler, but he's still hungry. Shelley sees him steal the cooler, but he says that he will keep his secret. The boys then see a storm coming over the horizon, and they scramble to get back to the cabin in order to find shelter. They're nervous to go in, though, because they know that Thomas is still dead in there. They make their way to the cellar and they see that the tape that Shelly has put over the door is still there. The other kids are removed at this and they remove it, seeing blood pooling underneath the door from where it had been taped over. The blood coming from underneath the door is obviously Tim's, but Tim is confused because he can't feel any pain. He instructs the boys on how to get ready for the storm, and he insists that they all stay in the cellar, so the geography of this is a little bit confusing, but right now Tim is locked up in the cabin with Thomas, who is dead, and he tells them all they need to get to the cellar because that's the safest place to be during a storm. Shelly, wanting to cause more chaos, reveals that Kent was the one who ate all the food, and the rest of the troop gets mad at him. Kent is in denial about his own sickness and he punches Shelly in the face, but he doesn't seem to mind. It seems that Shelly is trying to turn the other kids against each other. We don't yet know if there's any other reason for this other than his perceived sociopathy. But despite his sickness, Tim still seems helpful towards the kids, but warns them not to touch or eat anything so as not to transmit the disease to anyone else. We then get another experimental log from Dr. Edgerton. This time he has infected a chimpanzee with the worm. Like before, the chimp begins to eat everything it can before it uses its hand to rip into its own backside and forcibly remove the worm. It pulls out the giant worm and it seems to get better for a second. But then later, the chimp freaks out and starts to eat its own fur and it's like peeling its own skin off. It's really gross. At the same time, it's also developing these lesions all over itself. It then goes over to the coiled dead tapeworm on the ground and starts to eat it. And then eventually smaller tapeworms burst from the lesions and through the eye sockets of the chimp. It's a really gross chapter. The tapeworms seem to be reproducing inside of the chimp, and after it has ingested the entire dead tapeworm, the chimp finally dies. It leaves behind a large ball of tapeworms that dies shortly afterwards, and the experiment concludes. Back on the island, the storm is about to make landfall, and Ephraim is insisting that Kent not be let inside so as to not infect them. Kent has gone from his usual bully-like attitude to a more meek and humble one. He genuinely just doesn't want to be left outside. Newt objects to leaving him out there, but Ephraim steamrolls the conversation. Kent tries to rush past Ephraim, and this just completely sets Ephraim off. He mercilessly beats up Kent until he's just whimpering on the ground. Kent never put up much resistance, but Ephraim was so blinded by anger that he just kept beating him up. They end up dragging Kent over to the woodshed and put a tarp over him in order to protect him from the storm. Kent looks up at the boys that dragged him over there as if to plead with them not to leave him out in the storm, but he is distracted when a millipede crawls on his cheek. He then eats the millipede without a second thought, never breaking eye contact with Max as he does this. It appears that Ephraim has established himself as the new leader and is ruthless, even insulting Max, who is his best friend. Leaving Newt and Max to tend to Kent, Ephraim heads inside the cellar and sits with Shelly for a moment. Shelly congratulates him for becoming the new leader, and then he says he can see something moving around under Ephraim's fingernail. Ephraim checks, but he can't see anything. Shelly then just says it was nothing. Newt and Max enter the cellar, and they can hear the loud crashing of a downed tree hitting the roof of the cabin. They then hear Kent pounding at the door and begging to be let in. Ephraim finally relents and decides to let Kent stay inside with them as long as he keeps his distance. Ephraim then looks at Kent's wounds and then back at his own bloody hands from when he beat him up and realizes that he's already made contact with the infected Kent. We then get more testimony from somebody who is working on the experiment. They explain that the worms were meant to be taken in a pill. They would help the host lose weight and then another pill would flush all the worms out of their system. That was the plan, but obviously something went wrong along the way. Back on the island, the storm has now passed. The boys, except for Kent, leave the cellar and go to check on Tim. And when they get to the cabin, Tim is dead. He has been crushed by a fallen tree. His head is cracked open like an eggshell, they say. The boys only have a minute to take it all in before they see something moving underneath the Scoutmaster's skin. A ball of tapeworms then bursts from Tim's stomach and they start to writhe around. Ephraim notices that each worm has a small mouth and they hiss and inch their way towards them. While the worms aren't nearly as big as the ones they found in Thomas, they're still intimidating. They lunge at Ephraim, who swats them away with his hands. Ephraim then looks down at the own open wounds on his fists, and Max can tell what he is thinking. He is surely infected with the worms by now. We then get an article from a scientific journal regarding the parasites. Now they're calling them hydatid worms. I'm not going to use that word a whole bunch because it's kind of difficult to say. But anyway, we learned that they're able to change their genetic code on a dime and adapt to any circumstance, and that there are two different kinds of worms, devourers and conquerors. Conquerors can only consume waste products and will attempt to reproduce and consume until the host dies. That is what we saw with the guinea pig, but the devourer worm will consume all of the tissue of the host and is much larger. That is what we saw with the chimpanzee. The devourer worm only exists to eat and lay eggs and to duplicate itself over and over again. The boys start to try to make a plan. Newt comes up with some ideas of what they can do, but Shelley's now insisting that they won't be allowed to leave the island since they are contaminated. They can see the military ships in the distance, but realize that nobody's coming to save them. When it looks like all hope is lost, they actually see a small boat racing towards them from the island. They recognize it as a boat of one of the locals in the town that they are from. They watch in excitement as their rescue speeds towards the island before it is chased down by two military boats. The military men board the small boat for a moment before leaving with the men that were on the small boat. The boat then explodes and sinks. Nothing is coming to save these boys. Newt then goes back to the cabin to retrieve his field book, which he says has necessary information on how they can survive in the wild. He reflects on his past and on his mom, who by all accounts is a lovely woman. She seems to really care for him, and as he searches for the cabin for his field book, he can hear the hissing of the worms. Somehow they are still alive despite their host being dead. He ends up retrieving the book and he runs out of the cabin. We then get a newspaper article that says that both Kent and Max's dad have been arrested for violating the no watercraft zone. They were the ones in the boat attempting to reach the boys. Their boat was destroyed because the military feared contamination. After Newt retrieves his field book, he heads out with Max and Ephraim to find something to eat. Ephraim is already starting to show signs of the all-consuming hunger, although it could just be normal hunger because they haven't eaten for a while. This chapter is actually rather wholesome, as Max and Ephraim are just content to let Newt lead the way, since he knows the most about foraging food. Newt eats a grub from under a rock, and he just remarks that it tastes awful. It's like kind of a fun moment between all of them. However, our next chapter is all about Shelley, and I'm going to say now that if you have an issue with hearing people talk about harming small animals, then you should probably back out of this video now. Things are about to get really rough. Shelley is thrilled to be on his own. Now that Ephraim, Max, and Newt are gone, he decides he can put his plan into action. He recalls the time his mother took in a stray kitten that they found under their deck. His mom loved the kitten, but Shelley had other plans for it. One day when his parents were out of the house, Shelley took the kitten into the bathroom and forcefully drowned it. He did it slowly and then he burned the body afterwards. Notably, he also seemed to get very excited at what he was doing. He was flying his flag at full mast, if you know what I mean. It's absolutely disgusting and gross. Now that Shelley is alone, he goes back to the cellar to find Kent. They have locked him in a room and Kent is begging for something to eat. Shelley says that there is no food before saying that a helicopter dropped something for them to eat. He makes Kent beg for food before feeding him some dead bugs that he finds in the cabin. When Kent reaches under the door for the bugs, Shelley notices that he is missing his fingernails. Kent has presumably eaten them in his hunger, and now he has only the raw, bloody pads where his nails should be. The sight of this gets Shelley excited once again. With Kent still begging for food, Shelley goes back to the room with the now dead Thomas and picks up the dead tapeworm on the ground. He takes it back to Tent and he eats it up without any question. Shelley then alludes to a plan that he has to cause chaos among the group. He has planted a walkie-talkie in Ephraim's bag and plans to use it somehow. I have to say so far that this story has gone in a completely different direction than I thought it would. I thought for sure we were getting a story about a scout troop being hunted by Starvin' Marvin on an isolated island. Then, after Thomas died, I assumed that Tim would go nuts. I was expecting a horrifying psychopath to show up. I just didn't think it would be one of the kids. At this point, Ephraim has completely given up on finding food. He has sat down and is refusing to go anywhere else. He just sees it all as pointless. Newt and Max try to get him to continue on their journey with him, but he ends up getting upset and punching Max in the jaw. Max is quick to forgive his best friend, and Ephraim is quick to apologize, but he insists that Newt and Max leave him behind, so they do. Ephraim, now alone, sits and thinks about how screwed he is. He hasn't seen the worms in his skin, but he swears he can feel them. He then hears Shelley's voice through the walkie-talkie that is in his bag. Shelley tells him that he can help him, and he instructs Ephraim to use the blade of his Swiss Army knife to cut into the skin of his fingers. Ephraim obeys, cutting deeply into the skin of his already wounded fingers, but he doesn't see any worms. Shelly tells him he needs to cut deeper or look somewhere else for them. Ephraim pulls out the corkscrew attachment and considers putting it in his ear before he ends up backing out. The walkie-talkie then seems to die, and Ephraim picks up the knife again, ready to get to work. For some reason, anything to do with the smaller parts of the body absolutely grosses me out. I can handle some pretty terrible things, but thinking about flaying the skin from your own fingers is just incredibly gross and unnerving. I can feel that pain in my mind when I think about it. Same thing with digging a corkscrew into your ears. This book is starting to live up to its disturbing reputation, so let's keep going. We then cut back to Max and Newt searching for food. They find a couple of patches of blueberries and eat them for a while. They're ecstatic about this, and they even have enough to take back to Ephraim. Both of them are hungry, but neither of them feel as intensely hungry as Kent is at the moment, so they figure that they're good. They don't feel like they're going crazy yet. They try to build an animal trap before they see a sea turtle in a tide pool. What follows is probably the roughest chapters so far, so if you don't want to hear about animal cruelty, then you might want to click away. The boys then descend on the turtle. The turtle puts up a fight and snaps at them and even bites into Max's toe. They end up falling into the tide and have to drag the turtle back to shore. It's got flippers, so it can't really walk on the sand very well. Max flips the turtle onto its shell before repeatedly stabbing at its underside. He was hoping to kill it quickly, but the turtle doesn't seem to die. He just keeps stabbing at it, and the turtle won't die. At one point, Newt comes over and joins in and tries to slice the turtle's head off, but the turtle retreats into his shell, and Newt only slashes at its jaw. And then after an agonizing amount of times, the turtle finally stops moving. Both of the boys are in tears at this point, and they end up burying the turtle in the sand, not wanting to eat it. They're just disgusted by what they've done. This chapter is brutal, but I like how it shows that both Max and Newt have good hearts deep down. They were simply too hungry to prevent themselves from attacking the turtle. They try to kill it quickly and are horrified to learn how long it actually takes to kill an animal. They aren't anything like Shelly is. Newt is also becoming my favorite character. He seems to have a good heart, which I'm sure doesn't bode well for the future. We then get another excerpt from a scientific journal. We learn that humans are typically infected with a devourer worm, and when those worms start to reproduce, one of them becomes or mutates into the conqueror worm, which then snakes its way up the spinal column of the victim and into the brain stem. It then forces the brain to think that it's starving, and that's why the worms eat so much, and that's why the humans that are infected eat so much. The scientist says that this hijacking of the brain seems to cause the humans to lose sense of pain or fear. We then learn that someone from the scout troop said that their troop mates seemed to get stronger and happier when they were falling apart. Notably, this boy is both unnamed and also referred to as the only survivor from the incident. We then go back to Ephraim. Shelly is still talking to him on the walkie-talkie. It didn't die after all. Shelly just wanted to leave him alone. Ephraim is covered in blood and is sliced through to his ankle bone, where he swears he can see the worm. He tries to grab it, but it wriggles away. Shelly encourages him to keep cutting, and Ephraim turns his attention to the own exposed stomach on his skin. The next chapter is another passage from a book about the Troop 52 incident. It is an interview with Kent's dad, who is currently in a really rough spot. He claims that he was beaten by the military when they found him on the boat trying to save his son, and that Kent never came home, although the military never quite confirmed his death. Kent's dad says that Kent was a strong kid who wouldn't have gone down without a fight, though. We then go back to Kent, who is actually starting to feel great. He says that he feels like a superhero and that he's going to wait for Shelly to return so he can kill him. Whatever the worms have done to him, it seems that he has conquered it and he is getting stronger by the second. He feels fantastic. Shelly then decides that it's time to kill Kent. He spears a rotten fish and takes it down to the cellar where Kent is waiting for him. Only something is wrong. Kent is covered in what looks like large bee stings, his eyes are yellow and leaking pus, and his teeth are rotting out of his gray gums. Kent takes a step towards Shelly, but he is weak and unable to do much. Shelly flaunts the rotten fish in front of his face, and Kent starts to follow it like a dog on a leash. The parasite has completely destroyed Kent's ability to process the world around him. He isn't strong, he isn't a superhero. He's not much more than a bloated corpse at this point. Shelly leads Kent over to the water with the dead fish, and he throws it into the water. Kent dives in after it and starts eating it, and then Shelly holds Kent underwater until he drowns. Shelly is hoping to see something that he can't quite explain. He wants to feel euphoric as he sees Kent take his last breath, but that feeling never comes, and Shelly seems kind of frustrated by that. Then, as he's still holding Kent's dead body, Shelly feels the worms start to attack him. They bite at him and snake his way into his clothes. They even crawl up into his male parts, if you know what I mean. Another incredibly distressing and painful image, especially if you are a man. He knows that he's screwed up and he heads back to the campfire. And he's already hungry and he starts eating the dirt around him, shoveling it into his mouth. He's fully infected by the worms at this point. We then cut back to Newt and Max, who are sitting by a fire they have made. They've stripped down to their underwear since their clothes are still wet from the incident with the turtle. Newt wonders if Scoutmaster Tim has gone to heaven, and Max reassures him that Tim was a good man. They then hear the sound of something cracking, and they see some baby sea turtles hatching from eggs laid in the sand. Newt tells Max not to touch them or they will be abandoned by their mother, before they realize they've already taken care of the mother, if you know what I mean. The two boys then carefully escort the hatchlings into the ocean, fighting off the dive-bombing birds as they do. And I do have to say, nothing bad happens to those sea turtle babies, don't worry. I was worried about that when I read the story. The sea turtle babies make it out fine, so don't need to worry about that. We then get another passage of the book about the scout troop. Our author ends up meeting with Dr. Edgerton in jail. He has no remorse for his actions and all the pain they have caused. He says that the best transmitter of a contagion is love, because he says humans will do anything to save those that they love instead of simply staying away, and that is how disease spreads. After that, we get the image of an unreleased ad for Thestomax. That was what the worm pill was supposed to be called. For obvious reasons, it never went to market. Shelley at this point is now fully infected with the worms. He creates a little nest for himself in the cabin and he starts to eat the floorboards. He can feel the wooden splinters digging into his gum as he eats, so that's another awesome image for you to be left with. And then he reflects on the fact that he's neither aroused for boys nor girls, but is simply interested in the disgust that he generates when he messes with people or does inappropriate things to them. Again, Shelley's really messed up. Terrible, awful person. He then feels the conqueror worm snaking its way up his spine until it finds its way into his brain. As soon as that happens, he starts to feel warm and good inside. He then starts to feel intensely hungry. The conqueror worm has done his job and it's taken over Shelley's mind completely. Newt and Max wake up and set out in search of Ephraim. They find him in a terrible state. He has cut large portions of himself all over his body. He has gouges in his stomach and his feet. He also has a sizable hole in his cheek that they say he can see his tongue from, but he is still alive. Ephraim then insists that Max use his knife to cut the worms out of him, but Max notes that Ephraim doesn't look much skinnier than when he arrived, and that he might not even be infected after all. Max refuses, but then he realizes that he needs to trick Ephraim into stopping his own self-mutilation. He says that they have mushrooms that act as a laxative, and that they will use them to have Ephraim pass the worms. If that doesn't work, then Max will do as he says. The boys then head back to the cabin. I should say, the mushrooms are legit. Newt did find those, and they do make you throw up or have diarrhea. So he wasn't lying there completely. They make it back to the cabin after 3 hours of hauling Ephraim through the woods, who passes out soon after they arrive. Seeing no sign of Kent or Shelley, Max wonders what happened to them. He also wonders how he and Newt have managed to stay sane throughout the entire ordeal. Then he starts to hear screaming. We get part of the assistant researcher to Dr. Edgerton's testimony in court. The prosecutor reveals that while the worms were funded by a grant to be used as a diet pill, they were also being funded by a military organization that was looking for a bioweapon. The worms were planned to be destructive from the start. The assistant swears that he didn't know this was the case. Newt and Max are down by the beach. I should say that when they heard the screaming earlier, they were already down at the beach. And Shelley sees this as his time to strike. He finds the mangled Ephraim laying in the dirt and makes him beg him to cut the worms out of him. Shelley pulls out his knife and he starts to cut into Ephraim's ear. And he is just so delirious that he doesn't even seem like he feels the pain. And he's thanking Shelley the entire time. Shelley's just mutilating him. Shelley cuts the skin away from Ephraim's scalp. I mean, he's literally scalping him with this knife that Shelley says he sharpened before they got there. And he just relishes the entire experience. He then gets another idea. He tells Ephraim that he has to burn the worm out of him. He fills a jar with gasoline from the generator they have, and Ephraim gladly pours it on himself. Shelley is excited about this whole ordeal, and he's already planning on killing Newt and Max afterwards. He's just gone completely insane at this point. Newt and Max can hear screaming coming from the camp, and they run back, where they find Ephraim on fire. He is screaming and trying to put himself out, but it's of no use. He lays down and dies, and they say that he dies like in a curled up position, and that like the flesh from his kneecaps is like fused to his forehead. It's a really gross image. But anyway, he lays down and dies, and Max then sees Shelley rounding the corner and launches into a rage. He yells at Shelley, knowing that he had something to do with Ephraim's death. He charges at Shelley, who then stabs him in the abdomen with his knife. Before Shelley can do any more damage, though, Newt hits him on the back of the head, and Shelley falls over. Newt is the GOAT. Shelley finds his bearings while Max is staring down at the knife in his chest. He gets super angry at Shelley as you would and threatens to kill him. Shelley responds to this by spitting at Max, and the spit, Max can see those little worms wriggling around. He manages to avoid the spit before throwing a rock straight at Shelley's knee, which seems to kind of break his knee, and then Shelley scurries away. Newt then helps Max dress his wound. Remember, he got stabbed by Shelley. They bury Ephraim, and they think about just how dire the situation they are in is. Newt makes another fire, and Max falls asleep quickly. The two boys wonder why no one has come to save them yet. We then cut to Shelley, who has completely lost his mind at this point. He is ecstatic at the thought of the worms living inside of him, and he thinks of them as his children. He starts to feel strong, and he knows that he needs to kill Max and Newt. He eats a handful of wood lice, and for a brief moment realizes he's being eaten alive, but those thoughts quickly disappear. It's like he has one moment where he's like, crap, I'm being devoured by these worms, but then it all goes away. He makes his way back to the campfire, but Newt ends up seeing him. Newt pulls out his knife, sticks it into the log, and tells Shelley to get away. Shelley retreats back into the woods. The only thought in his mind is just to eat and eventually spawn the worms into somebody else. The next chapter is a bit of testimony from the military commander in charge of containing the biohazard on Falstaff Island. He says that he had no choice but to leave the boys on the island, and he says that he made sure that nothing came and nothing went from the island. They even had snipers shooting down the birds and a hazmat crew collecting the corpses of those birds. Nothing came and nothing went. He says even information, they wouldn't even give them notes or anything from their parents. Newt wakes Max up from a nightmare. They haven't seen Shelley and decide to head to the boat that Thomas took to the island. They try to start it, but it won't budge. The spark plugs are missing. Max then realizes that he knows where the spark plugs are because he saw them in Thomas's stomach when Tim cut him open. Remember, Max was the person who did the surgery with Tim. They head back to the cabin and put on several layers of gloves before Max reaches into Thomas's half-eaten, decrepit stomach. He feels around in there for a second before locating the spark plugs. Relieved, the boys are filled with hope for the first time since they set foot on the island. They head back to the boat and watch the spark plugs. They then check the fuel in the boat and they see that it's almost gone. Newt and Max then head back to the generator to find more gasoline after leaving the spark plugs on a rock on the beach to dry out. Finding the generator empty, they go to the cellar to find the spare can of gasoline that they have mercifully full. When they head back to the boat, they see that the spark plugs are gone. This sparks an argument between the two boys that ends up coming to blows. After a brief fight, Newt helps Max up and the two realize that Shelley must have taken them. They still have to find him. They talk about food for a while, and Max realizes that Newt is actually a pretty cool guy. Newt shares a story of when he was in middle school and that he was given a sack of flour to take care of for a class. He says that he is naturally sweaty and that he tried to care for the bag too much. He was just touching it too much and ended up getting wet from his sweat and ripping. He says that his mom acts in a similar way to him. She wants to take care of him, but he thinks it ends up hurting him in a weird way, like she's too hands-on. Soon, they smell the sickly sweet smell of Shelley, which is like the smell that people smell when they're affected by the worm. And it wafts through the air, and they know he's nearby. They play rock, paper, scissors to determine who will go down the path that they think he's down first, and Max wins. Max then suggests that they go side by side, but Newt insists on going first, saying that it's only fair. At the end of the path, the boys find a cave. They head inside and see the spark plugs sitting in a pool. After seeing that there are no worms in the water, they pick up the plugs and turn to leave before hearing the sound of something scuttling around. Shelley then crawls out of the shadows. At this point, he is completely consumed by the worms. He is naked and his skin is completely white. His teeth are rotted out of his mouth and his bulbous stomach hangs down. They say it's like dragging on the ground as he crawls around. Max makes a run for the exit and Newt falls closely behind before Shelley grabs onto Newt's leg. Newt freaks out and tries to get Shelley off of him before hearing a sickly bursting sound. Shelley's stomach has exploded. The light from his flashlight illuminates Shelley's smiling face as he lays there dead. He is finally actually dead. His organs and his insides are now strewn over the rocks in the cave and they've exploded all over Newt. We then go back to the testimony of the military admiral. The lawyers question him and we find out that the admiral was on a bioweapons board that was in communication with Dr. Edgerton. We also learn that Thomas escaped from the lab with the help of a locksmith that was on military leave approved by this admiral. The lawyer then questions the admiral if he knew about Thomas and the admiral keeps his silence. The lawyer suggests that letting Thomas loose onto the boys on the island would have been the perfect way to see if the bioweapon that was the worms was effective. The Admiral again maintains his silence. It seems that this was planned for them to unleash this horror onto these kids in order to see if it was an effective weapon. I guess they were right. Back on the island, Max and Newt stumble out of the cave, and Newt is covered in the gore from the explosion that was Shelley. He tells Max to stay away and washes up in the ocean. He takes mushrooms to make himself vomit, and he can see hundreds of minuscule worms wriggling around in his vomit. Newt is starting to feel the hunger, and he says he can feel the worms inside of him. Max then sees a helicopter flying close by, and he tries to get its attention, but the pilot pays him no mind, even though he can obviously see him. Newt then has Max look at his eyes as he can feel the worms squirming behind them. Max spots a worm in the eyeball itself, but it stops moving when Max sees it, almost as if it knew that it was being watched. Newt and Max had fled the cave too quickly, and they realized they dropped the spark plugs. Newt begs Max not to go back, but he does anyway, armed with a single flare. He lights it and heads into the cave, and he sees the corpse of what used to be Shelley laying next to a small pool where the spark plugs are laying. He reaches for the plugs and notices a ball of the tapeworms. They're hissing and feeling the air turning towards him slowly. He grabs the plugs and the flare starts to sputter and go out. In the darkness, he can make out the image of Shelley slowly moving towards him. He panics and falls, sinking his hands into Shelley's rotten flesh. He manages to get his bearings and he heads towards the mouth of the cave. Looking back, you can see that Shelley is certainly dead. He is just being puppeteered by an enormous tapeworm that is now hanging out of his body, standing stiff and straight in the air. Max shudders and leaves the cave with the spark plugs in hand, so mission successful. He makes his way back to the boat where Newt has grown noticeably thinner. He's starting to eat the pebbles on the beach as well. He pours the gasoline into the boat, and Newt tells him to leave without him, but Max won't do it. He says that Newt can ride in front while Max stays in the back, so they never touch. Newt agrees. Newt reinserts the spark plugs and gets the engine started, and the boys start their journey back to the military boats that are surrounding the island. Newt tells Max about a dream he had, one where some people started fighting and the violence kept spreading and spreading like a virus until everyone was beating each other up. As their boat reaches the military boats, a searchlight shines over the two boys. Max says that they are fine, they just need help, and then Newt gets to his feet and starts laughing, which makes Max nervous. Newt then starts to tell the military that he's hungry before he is shot in the neck. He falls over into the ocean and disappears into the deep sea. Max cries out in despair before he sees a red dot on his own chest. We then get more testimony, this time from the sniper that shot and killed Newt. The lawyer wants to know why he did it, and the sniper says that he had certain words that, if said by any of the people on the island, should result in their immediate death. Among the words were worm and parasite, but Newt was killed because he simply said that he was hungry. Another excerpt from the book about the troop details the author visiting Max in his containment facility. He used to be completely isolated so as not to transmute anything to anything else. He doesn't seem to remember much about the island, but he does have some things to say about the people that he was there with. This is what he says about all of them. Tim Riggs was the coolest adult I ever knew, but he didn't try hard to be cool. He was actually sort of not cool with the way he dressed and his fussiness, but he was cool because he treated us the way he'd treat grown-ups. Ephraim was my best friend. You could count on him. He always stuck up for you. He had a really big heart. I just think that on the island, something crawled into his head and he couldn't get rid of it. I still have a hard time believing Kent is gone. I mean, he was like Superman. Really, he was. If anyone could have swum back to North Point, it was Big K. There was something the matter with Shelley. I'm not so sad about him, to be honest. That's a crappy thing to say, but whatever. Newt would have been a great dad. The best. I just know it. He knew so much. The strongest of any of us. I really wish we hadn't ragged on him so bad. When asked about what else he can remember, he simply says, there was a turtle. He talks about how hard it is to kill something, that it simply clung onto life so aggressively. He finishes by saying, I killed a turtle, and the interview ends there. We then get the next chapters that are from Max's point of view. He says he was eventually cleared by the military and deemed safe to return to society. He now lives at home, but nobody wants to come in contact with him. He isn't allowed to go to school, and he has to see the same psychiatrist who looked after Newt and Ephraim. The doctor always wears a mask when they meet. The last chapter sees Max borrow his uncle's boat and head off to Falstaff Island. There is nothing but the charred husk of where the island once stood. He looks at the desolation and thinks of the own emptiness inside of him, and we end with this. The emptiness? Max leaned both of his hands on the edge of the boat. A nameless hunger was building inside of him. It gnawed at his guts with teeth that called his name. And that is it for The Troop by Nick Cutter. I really enjoyed this book, even though it was very different from what I was expecting. I want to take just a minute to talk about the different theories and what the ending of this book could really mean. I think the ending is insinuating that the worms actually did live on inside of him. They just never caught them. I think this is what is referenced when he talks about how he looks into Newt's eye and the worm stops moving. It's like the worms know how to stay hidden, and they eventually grew inside of Max, because we know that eventually this developed into like a giant plague that ravaged the whole earth. So he would have been like the first person to spread it to other people because the worms got smart enough to essentially hide. I could see the worms surviving because it said they could change their DNA on the spot, so it kind of laid dormant inside of him. So that's what I think the ending means. The worm just stayed alive and eventually infected everybody else. Overall, just a really cool book with a really interesting premise. I think it would make a really good movie. It'd just be a little bit gross and like, I don't know, you'd have a lot of violence towards kids, which is usually like a no-no in movies, but I don't know, movies like Dr. Sleep and The Summer of '88 do it, so, you know, pretty cool. If you liked this video, then please comment and subscribe. I really like making this kind of content. I like reading this disturbing stuff, even though it does kind of mess with my head a little bit. The Tenders the Flesh video did really well, so I just want to make another one of these. So again, if you like this stuff, please subscribe. I'm trying to hit 1,000 subscribers before my birthday, which is in April, so that would be awesome. I'm on my way there. So thank you guys so much for watching. You can expect a lot more videos of me in the future. This is my last video of 2024. If you haven't read this book, then please go read it if you're interested. I promise reading it, even though you've heard this entire explanation, is still a really good experience. It's still really fun and gross and nasty. So please go read that, and thank you so much for watching. I'll see you guys later. See ya.